știm noi din vremuri strămoșești, cuvânt de dor și luptă, de doine și povești. Dar dacă astăzi pacea e lege și scut, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. Le-am moștenit în grai, doar bănuiam ce-nseamnă, ce tâlcuri au sub strai. Dar dacă astăzi tâlcul de plin l-am priceput, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. окраин, южный гор до северных морей. Человек проходит, как хозяин необъятной родины своей. Тут жизнь невольна и широка, точно Волга полная течет. Молодым везде у нас дорога, старикам везде у нас почет. Страна моя родная, слава я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой на тысячу лет. Я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой на тысячу лет. За столом никто у нас не лишний, по заслугам каждый награжден. Золотыми буквами мы пишем всенародный сталинский закон. Этих слов величие и славу никакие годы не сотрут. Человек всегда имеет право на учение, подвиг и на труд. Страна моя родная, слава ей, слава ей. Я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой на тысячу лет. Я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой на тысячу лет. Над страной весенний ветер веет, каждым днем все радостнее жить. И никто на свете не умеет лучше нас смеяться и любить. Но сурово брови мы насупим, если враг захочет нас сломать. Как небесную родину мы любим, бережем, как ласковую мать. Страна моя родная, слава ей, слава ей. Я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой на тысячу лет. Я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой на тысячу лет.
что рабочий ты сам. И так как все мы люди, то должны мы извинить, и что-то есть. Хотят накормить нас пустой болтовней, чертям спасибо за честь. Марш левый, два, три, марш левый, два, три, взять ряды, товарищ, нам. Ты войдешь в наш единый рабочий фронт, потому что рабочий ты сам. И так как ты рабочий, то не жди, что нам поможет другой. Себе мы свободу добудем твою своей рабочей рукой. Марш левый, два, три, марш левый, два, три, взять ряды, товарищ, нам. Ты войдешь в наш единый рабочий фронт, потому что рабочий ты сам. In der Arbeiter Einheitsfront, weil du auch ein Arbeiter bist. Ты войдешь в наш единый рабочий фронт, потому что рабочий ты сам. Rein ein in der Arbeiter Einheitsfront, weil du auch ein Arbeiter bist.
Pod słońcem rasti jasna dzieci, rasti i cvietaj zemljoradnih ljudi i neka mir nad tvojim ljudima vlada, mir tvojim lađama napuči i tvome danu što se vedar budi. Rasti sretna da svi narodi vide, sa strana svih, sa juga i sjevera, kako se rađa i kako se voli, kako se brani zemlja proletera. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Sreći u vodi i u zraku, u pjesmi strojeva i u sjaju žita. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. холостяк, в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, реют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы. Будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути. И он продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь.
Greetings, everybody, and welcome along. It is the afternoon of the 24th of October, 2025, and you join us for a live stream following the new format, looking at a few current issues and then going into a political and historical discussion later on, and also taking questions. Now, just a bit of housekeeping before we get going. Be sure to like and share this stream across all platforms. We are currently live on X and on YouTube and on Twitch and on Rumble and now on Substack as well. So be sure to join the fray over there as well. We want to spread this project out to as many different platforms as possible and as many different formats as possible. So we will be doing a stream up to probably around about 2:30 today because I have to run off and then immediately record a Decline and Fall episode as well. because we got one of those coming your way tomorrow, the regular episode. And then we got another interesting interview coming up on the Decline and Fall show regarding the Dayton Accords. So be sure to join us for that. So three interrelated subjects on the cards today in terms of the news and discussion section, which are as follows. Discussion about Japan, because as the title of this stream indicates, Japan has yet another new prime minister. This time, Sanae Takaichi is her name, first female prime minister of Japan. Already the financial press, mostly Bloomberg and Financial Times and others, getting very, very excited about this inevitable Thatcher comparisons, because Thatcher is the absolute hero to all of these people. And, you know, in fairness, from the perspective of their class, that is entirely justified. She did more than anyone else to break down and destroy the militant working class traditions in this country, that is old perfidious Albion. So from the point of view of the ruling class, they're always looking for another Thatcher. But that only goes to show their profound misunderstandings of what made Thatcherism actually succeed. And we may go into that at some stage in the future if there's a specific demand for an analysis of Thatcherism, Reaganism, etc. So Sanae Takaichi becomes prime minister again in a moment of crisis for Japanese capitalism. Now, the reason why this is interesting is not just because, of course, the long-standing dominant force in Japanese bourgeois politics, the Liberal Democratic Party, has been in an escalating crisis for a long time now. It's because the case of Japan is very interesting. Now, for those of you who've been following the programming here for quite some time, you will know that we, back in the audio only days of Red Star Radio, myself and my former podcasting partner, Layla, did a show on the Japanification of the finance capital, which is still interesting. I would recommend that you go back and listen to that if you want a primer on this. But to give you a shortcut as to why this is an interesting study. Sanae Takaichi is an avowed follower of course, former and late Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. And this leads us into a discussion of Abenomics, such as it is, and what that means. But before we get to that, more broadly, the context of the Japanese crisis. Because Japan's been in going for a long period of stagnation ever since the early 1990s. Now, there are, of course, there's more than a single cause here for the crisis in Japan. There is, of course, the natural tendency in capitalism towards vast amounts of overproduction of both commodities and capital, leading to drastic collapses. But there are more proximate causes than the within that general trend. So, if you cast your minds back, if you're old enough to remember this, and I've had to do research on this, the state of play in Japan in the early to mid 1980s with regard to its economic development was producing a hysteria within the United States, which is has certain similarities to the hysteria around China now, albeit with some very crucial differences. If you look back into the early to mid 1980s, there was a big concern in US bourgeois circles that they were being outcompeted and outstripped by Japan. The Japanese technology and Japanese commodities were supplanting the United States, even within the borders of the United States itself. So this produced a political concern within the bourgeois system of the United States, within the hierarchy of US imperialism, which led to a a series of panics, a series of political maneuverings and pressure being brought to bear in on Japan, and the whole process of paranoia was not just, of course, about Japan. It was also about the Federal Republic of Germany, or West Germany, because again, like these were two economies which the US had rebuilt or had assisted in the rebuilding of following the defeat of these two fascist countries in World War II. The US imperialists using the Marshall Plan in Europe and using using military, shall we say, Keynesian methods in Japan, rebuilt the two economies. Japan benefited enormously from its position as a reliable, essentially giant military base for US imperialism in the Korean War. That actually helped to kickstart Japanese industry again. That period of time, leading to a long period of Japanese industrial expansion. Now, of course, there was a pre-existing industrial base and technical knowledge in Japan prior to World War II. It became an imperialist power precisely because it built up that strong industrial and technological base back in the very late 19th century, early 20th century. But the growth in Japanese and West German market share and the creation of a US trade deficit in the 1980s caused a political problem inside the United States for the Reagan administration. So what they aimed to do essentially was to address this trade deficit, which had been made worse by the fact that the dollar was strong, and to get essentially to weaken the dollar vis-a-vis the Japanese yen and the West German Deutschmark by intervening in the currency market. So essentially, the Plaza Accords got the Japanese especially to revalue the yen, which is what the US was essentially after. Make American exports more competitive, and to essentially render them cheaper to trading partners across the world. So this was as part of a political maneuvering between the Reagan administration and the US Congress. So they by revaluing, in fact, worsening the value of the dollar, they hoped to increase competitivity of American products and services in the overseas export market, and to make German and especially Japanese exports less appealing by getting them to essentially revalue their currencies to stand at higher values. So the lower, I mean, we'll get to this with Abenomics, the lower your currency is worth in terms of on the international currency markets, the better it is, theoretically at least, for your exporters. And that was one of the successes of Abenomics later on. But the Plaza Accords are credited in, certainly by the Chinese and by certain people within Japan, as starting the process by which the Japanese economy spiraled downwards, and it created a giant bubble which burst in the early 1990s, and also which enabled the US to snap up a lot of Japanese tech firms as things went pop in Japan. Now, this was, ordinarily a recession in a capitalist economy need not lead to a crisis, but at this stage, it did lead to a crisis, reflecting actually the wider crisis-riven nature of the Western imperialist bloc and its allies at the time, which is largely forgotten now, except by a few people. But it led to not just a 5 or even a 10-year crisis, but now we're really looking at like a 30-year crisis in Japan, because they never recovered to the rates of growth that had been present prior to 1990. And this led to a long-term crisis in Japanese politics, which various prime ministers, mostly from the LDP, came in and tried to address in various ways, trying to increase labor productivity, trying to increase the rate of exploitation of the Japanese working class, trying to revive Japanese exports. And the one who came the closest to being able to do it was Shinzo Abe, who Sanae Takaichi is an avowed protege of. Now, Abe was in office for about 8 years, and he had what was called a free arrows approach to the crisis of Japanese capitalism. And what's remarkable is that for all of the noise that Abe's policy created, just how little in the end he managed to move the dial. So I'll explain the free arrows here, because it seems that Takaichi is trying to go back towards this. So the free arrows policy was, first of all, again in line with other practices in imperialist countries, that in April 2013, Abe got the Bank of Japan to launch a quantitative and qualitative easing program. So basically meaning that they got the Bank of Japan to engage in vast buying of government debt, and it was a gigantic intervention in terms of spending 60 to 70 trillion yen annually, later increased to 80 trillion yen in terms of asset purchases, debt purchases, by October 2014. So by 2018, the Bank of Japan's assets that it had bought exceeded by 70% Japanese GDP. So that's a gigantic asset purchasing program. It was bigger than the similar program of quantitative easing that was run by the Federal Reserve in the same time period. Japan also, in the Abenomics period, took a policy of adopting negative interest rates. So essentially, like it was, the interest rate went down to minus 0.1. And this was all designed to encourage the Japanese capitalist class to actually invest, to lend. You see, one of the things that you saw in Japan, and then more widely in the imperialist bloc, especially after 2008, was that the capitalists weren't lending to each other. The banks weren't lending. They weren't investing. They certainly weren't investing in the home countries, because the rate of return was too small. And this is why in Britain they called it like the credit crunch, meaning no one's lending. So you got a situation where the banks were lending, were being called upon by the government to lend to businesses again. But what was being done by the banking system was the opposite. The banks were very unwilling to invest anything. So the government's pouring all of this money into the banking system via quantitative easing, for instance, buying up various different bundles of debts and other assets. And the money is flowing into the banking system and they're not lending it. And this is a problem that was afflicting Japan. So they adopted this measure, which is a negative interest rate, to basically mean that you are saying to the capitalists, well, basically, if you sit on this money, it's actually going to be worth less, not more, over time. So the aim of it was to encourage investment. So that was the first part of it. And also to depreciate the value of the yen against the dollar. So it went from 80 yen to the dollar to 121 yen to the dollar between in 2 years, 2012 to 2014. Now, we'll come to the successes in just a moment. So that was the first part of it. Essentially a giant intervention by the Bank of Japan in terms of buying up assets, and also a concerted effort to lower the value of the yen to essentially make Japanese exports more competitive again. Second part of it was regard to fiscal policy. So Abe unveiled a 10.3 trillion yen stimulus package. Now, to give you an indication of the scale, I mean, this was credited with boosting a public works program in Japan. So it's something of a Keynesian response. But to give you an indication of scale, what is done here, 10.3 trillion stimulus package in terms of boosting investment, building infrastructure, etc. The asset purchases went up to 80 trillion yen by October of 2014. So the spending package was only 1/8 the size of the asset purchase, just to give you an indication of scale here. So in total, they ended up spending 19 trillion yen on infrastructure programs. Now, this was designed to essentially boost domestic demand, increase employment, more people building roads, more people building infrastructure. It's a more typical, straightforward, as I said, Keynesian style intervention. And this was designed to boost spending, something that Abe later tried to, in this very strange balancing act he was doing, later tried to restrict consumption by increasing the consumption tax from 5% to 8%, meaning that any immediate gain from that was wiped out. At least that's what it was blamed on. So you've got a stimulus package of a kind. Keynesians, of course, would argue that it was nowhere near enough. Essentially, it was somewhat successful, but again, probably way too small to actually make a real dent. The third part of this was what's referred to by economists who get very excited about hyper-exploitation of workers, was called the structural reform agenda. Now, one of the things that Abe was doing was trying to promote female participation in the workforce. He's trying to raise it to 73% by 2020. This target was not met. But what successive Japanese prime ministers have tried to do is to basically increase the amount of labor that's available for exploitation. So pushing more women into the workforce. And increasingly these days, there is talk of amongst capitalists of the need to slacken Japan's immigration system in terms of the laws on who can come in and work in the country. Because Japan, of course, has a massive demographic crisis caused by a birth rate that's been lower than replacement rate for many, many years now, meaning you've got an aging population and not enough workers going into the labor pool at the other end, because there were too few workers being born for the previous generation. Now, of course, we have discussed this here before, but I mean, it may be worth doing something specifically on birth rates. But of course, there's never, again, to go back to our discussion the other day of dialectical materialism on carrying out an analysis, the economic root of the birth rate crisis is in, tightened incomes, increased insecurity for working class families and even petty bourgeois families as well. It is the affordability of having a child just rules it out for a number of people. But it's not just that, because the birth rates were higher when people were poorer. You get that combined with the selling of the consumerist lifestyle to people. So the economic root is the starting point of our analysis here, as always. The economic root is the incomes crisis, the increased instability of Japanese life, the endless attempts to increase the rate of exploitation of the Japanese working class by the Japanese capitalists. All of that creates immiseration amongst the Japanese working class. And then for many, especially in the petty bourgeoisie or the upper end of the working class, having been sold the idea of the consumerist paradise, well, having children is seen as an infringement upon that. It's seen as something which impacts your ability to enjoy consumerism, which of course it does, because you have a child or children who, of course, need rather a lot of investment in. And so if the choice is for some of these petty bourgeois people, both in Japan, the United States, and in the wider West, if they can enjoy a life of consumerism or have a family, many of them choose consumerism. Many of them choose that route because that's the ideology that they've been told is the path to self-fulfillment. It's not having a family. It's not having to struggle and sacrifice and do a whole lot of things you don't want to do for the benefit of the next generation. No, it's going to enjoy yourself now, going to continue to enjoy yourself. Of course, that's a completely depressing and self-defeating way of living, but it's one that was actively encouraged by the bourgeoisie, who, in the manner of all of these things, are now panicking, realizing that that in the centers of imperialism, there haven't been enough births for over a generation. Japan is the worst in terms of its effects, but also you have the effects in places like South Korea. And then this is a bit of a digression, but you also then get into the problems of culture as well, because there is a cultural side to this, which is where you have a rotten, miserable culture piled on top of financial immiseration, continued downward pressure on workers' wages, continued attempts to increase the rate of exploitation, and you have a perfect perpetuation of societal decay and immiseration. You add on to that, in both the cases of South Korea and Japan, the long-term legacies of these being basically occupied nations controlled in a neo-colonial fashion by the United States. Then you have like a perfect storm of immiseration, financial and psychological, which creates this problem of the low birth rate. So now the Japanese ruling class are in a panic and they're considering encouraging immigration into the country. Now, they may be taking notes here off the British ruling class, who always encourage immigration into the country on the one hand and demonize the workers who come in on the other. This is the game. But to go back to Abe's agenda, the aim was to increase the labor force in order that you could have a greater pool of workers for the purposes of exploitation. If nothing else, then you can increase the reserve army of labor, use that to create downward pressure on workers' wages, etc., etc. Of course, this creates other contradictions for the capitalists as well, given that they've built Japan as a beacon of consumerism. If you're continually restricting the wages of the entire working class and pressing down upon them, that also creates a crisis because the workers stop spending. And you can't make up the shortfall just through the spending of the bourgeoisie or the upper part of the petty bourgeoisie. So essentially, if you look at the situation in Japan, it is, as we argued, I think successfully on the Red Star Radio episode, probably, how long ago is it now? Probably 3.5, 4 years ago. The long-term impact, the long-term decay of Japan, and all the contradictions and the inability of the capitalist class to get out of it, is essentially the future of the West. Many of the endless decay and also the endless attempts to boost boost spending, boost employment, but at the same time, the need to keep in place the current economic structure due to the inbuilt resistance of the ruling class to changes that could in any way threaten their own interests. So you've also got, I mean, the other part of Abe's agenda was, of course, so trying to increase the amount of labor that was available for exploitation. You also have in Japan like a 30-year trend, along with the rest of the US-led imperialist bloc, of casualization of labor. Increase the so-called labor flexibility, meaning more and more workers on temporary contracts, more and more workers going through agencies, more being employed as contractors rather than workers, meaning you get nominally higher wages, but also don't have any rights, essentially. And this is this sort of attempt to increase the rate of exploitation is one of the core parts of Abe's economic plan. So you got massive quantitative easing program, an attempt to an India 19 trillion yen stimulus program and infrastructure investment, and an attempt to increase the amount of labor that was available for exploitation by pushing more women into the labor market, and also the huge tax cuts for corporations. The pushing of the Trans-Pacific Partnership was also part of this, and then Trump, put a bullet through that. But also, I mean, the effects of this were nowhere near what Abe would have wanted, what the Japanese politicians wanted. So you got a boost in equities. So like the Nikkei index by May 2013 jumped by 55%, and in 2018 jumped to its highest level in 1991 since 1991. The big Japanese corporations like Toyota saw increase in profits by 89.5% in 2013. This was boosted by an increase in exports. So the devaluation of the yen did actually work for a while in terms of boosting Japanese exports, but again, not to the extent that it would have spelt a long-term recovery for Japan. So there was also unemployment did drop, but only by a percentage point overall. So it went from 4% unemployment officially declared. I mean, you've always got to take government employment statistics with a dump truck full of salt, really, from 4% to 3%. So there were some successes in terms of immediate economic uptick. But it then led to the same stagnation emerging, which is there was a slight increase in economic performance, but ultimately the problem reasserted itself. So whereas like the likes of Toyota gained trillions of yen in profits, the actual bulk of Japanese households didn't see the benefits that the corporations did. Of course, it's capitalism. Why would it be any other way? So the real wages in Japan have decreased by 9% since 1997, and in 2017 they fell again by 0.2%. So this really didn't fundamentally change, of course, the economic structure of Japan. It led to huge corporate gains in terms of profits, but it led to exceedingly little gain for, of course, the working class. Why would it be any other way? So the attempt to boost consumption that Abe carried out was half-hearted, was nothing like the attempts to buy up assets that he had carried out. Remember the disparity between the 19 trillion in total they spent on stimulus and the 80 trillion they spent purchasing debt, that the Bank of Japan spent purchasing debt. So in reality, there was a very slight economic uptick under Abe, which again looks, according to the bourgeois, comparatively good compared to like what happened afterwards. But in reality, like we're talking like very, very small improvements in an overall decline in Japan that goes on to this day. So whether Takaichi will be any different, I strongly suspect not, because still facing all the same problems, still unable to make any fundamental changes. Because as with all of the US imperialist bloc economies, to make fundamental changes would be to threaten core ruling class interests, and which of course they can't do. Now the funny thing is that Japan, of course, has still has a much more advanced industrial base than the rest of the West does, and is still able to export plenty of commodities a year. But again, they're still in this long-term stagnation. If anything, the crisis in the Western European countries, especially, will be even worse. So Takaichi, an avowed advocate of Abenomics, he is already pressuring the central bank of Japan to carry on to go down the same route that Abe did before, which is negative interest rates, a desperate attempt to get the capitalists to invest again by making by imposing those negative interest rates. Now, this did not work the first time to the extent that that it would have been needed to work to revive Japanese capitalism properly. It won't work the second time around either. So Takaichi is going to be another one of those Japanese prime ministers who's talked about in excited tones in the imperialist countries, only to probably come up way short. Their dream of another Thatcher remains just that, a dream. Though it'll be interesting to see what the developments in Japan are, because I'm aware it's somewhere I've not covered a great deal in the past, but there's a lot to be learned there from the 35-year crisis that has afflicted Japanese capitalism. So, moving on then to our next story, and thanks to all of you who've tuned in so far. Be sure to like and share the stream if you have not done so already. So, moving on to next story on the roster, which is the Western weeping over China's open AI models, including Deepseek, being provided to African nations. Now, I wanted to mention this because, of course, it knits in rather neatly with the way in which the current stock market bubble in the United States is developing. And the stock market bubble is something we discussed the other day. Of course, asset bubbles, etc., and various different investor crazes have gone on for a long time in the United States over the long period of decay since 2008. And this is, of course, nothing new. But the fact that there is so much being dumped into AI, and this links to our next story about the bank of bonuses. Now, the key thing to think about here is the fact that the AI models in the West, and the fact that there's so much investment going into them, it's all predicated upon, as we said the other day, the idea that this will secure a vast increase in labor productivity for the American capitalist class and their allies. However, the reason why Bloomberg and other financial press outlets are all weeping and wailing about this is the fact that they are being outcompeted and outmuscled by Chinese open source AI systems. And I say AI as a shorthand. I am, as I said the other day, fully aware of the fact that this is not true AI. This is machine learning. I'm using AI as a shorthand. So the fact that the Chinese are making Deepseek accessible and readily available to the African nations that they have ties to, and that this is a model which is, of course, out-competing the Western models now, not just DeepSeek, but the other Chinese open source AIs. This is part of the picture as to why there is so much rabid hostility towards China. And this links back to what we were saying earlier about the Plaza Accords and the attempts to sabotage the Chinese economy. Now, because Japan is an occupied nation, it is still ruled over essentially by the United States. We'll go into that in more detail in the future. The United States still gets an effective veto over much of what the Japanese government does. It's not a truly sovereign nation, hasn't been since 1945. So their attempt to pressure the Chinese to do something similar to what they did to the Japanese, and with the Plaza Accords, i.e. getting them to overvalue their currency, which is why if you look back at over the last decade, back longer, 20 years or more, one of the consistent whinges from the American capitalist class is that the Chinese yuan is undervalued. They keep complaining about it and complaining about it and complaining about it. and they think that that's part of the reason, or a big part of the reason, why they are getting muscled out of all these different markets by the Chinese. But of course, that's not the sole reason at all. But they were hoping that they could get the Chinese to sabotage themselves. So far, that hasn't been the case, and is unlikely to be the case because whilst there is a comprador danger in China, and that's something which is not appreciated anywhere near enough amongst admirers of China in the West. You can defend China against US imperialism. You can accurately state that China isn't imperialist. You can accurately state that the achievements of China in the modern era are built on the foundations of the Maoist socialist revolutionary period. But there's no reason to lie and pretend China doesn't have its contradictions. It does. And there is, within the Chinese capitalist class, a strong comprador tendency which does still exist and does exert influence. Fortunately for China, they don't have leading positions within the Chinese government. They don't have a strong enough influence on the CPC. And so the attempt by the US to force a Plaza Accords-like situation on the Chinese did not work. To go back to the AI question, the reason why the financial press is crying about the Chinese making Deepseek and other AI models readily available to African nations is because this was something that this was a market that the US capitalist class hoped to be able to exploit. They hoped to be able to provide the usual thing that they provide to developing world nations, which is overly expensive, requiring perpetual maintenance, like equipment or systems that can be continually milked for profit. If the Chinese are getting in there with an open source model that outcompetes the US, then that proposes a severe danger, because the investors might suddenly work out that all the money that they're dumping into the AI associated companies in the United States is something which is actually not particularly wise or good investment, and is not going to lead to the great revival of American capitalism that they hoped. And that might create a crisis, which is going to come anyway. But it's interesting to observe that the Chinese open source models are now becoming the biggest in the world, if not fully there already. So this is an interesting development, and it links directly again with final story and the news section here, which is of course the question of banker bonuses. Now, this is, of course, a story that was big in 2008 to 2012. Everybody was talking about this. Everybody was talking about the fact that the banker bonuses were what caused the crash, that the incentivization of risky behavior by the Wall Street banks and the City of London banks, via the providing of huge bonuses to senior executives and others, traders, etc., was a big part of the reason why so many risks were taken and why the subprime mortgage bubble emerged. Now we've got a statement on this. The New York State Comptroller office this week, stating that 130 firms that belong to the New York Stock Exchange had reached combined profits in the first half of this year of 30.4 billion, if you believe any of that's real, and that the average annual bonus was reaching $244,700. And a lot of this, according to a report in Bloomberg, a lot of this is based on investment in the AI bubble. So there were those Wall Street firms who have done well off essentially speculating upon how the tariffs are going to affect the market. There's been some firms have done well out of the tariff related speculation. But mostly it's been because of the fact that a lot of them have been dumping money into what's called AI stocks. So some of the big banks, Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan, Bank of America, Citigroup, Goldman Sachs, Wells Fargo have reported $15.4 billion in revenue just over the last quarter. That's the third quarter. So it's the highest covering the third quarter for the last 5 years, meaning, of course, everybody gets a hell of a lot of money for producing those results. Now, is it the case that, as some social democrats insist, that if you taxed banker bonuses more, that the risky behavior wouldn't happen? No, that's not the case. The bonus system, of course, incentivizes the speculators to take more risks, gamble harder, shall we say. But it's not the reason why wildly speculative behavior carries on inside Wall Street and inside the City of London. I mean, that's just a recognition by the management chains of the fact that the way in which capital is generated on Wall Street or in the City of London or in other financial centers as well is by essentially gambling on various different asset bubbles, and that's the business that has been built up in the financial sector over the previous generation. So the social democrats say, "Oh, evil bankers getting bonuses, and that's why they crashed our economy." That simply isn't true. Yes, the fact that these guys get a lot of money for engaging in wildly speculative behavior, there is a part of the factor as to why that behavior is encouraged. But that behavior is that the way the companies behave is necessitated by the stage of imperialism that we're in. Stage of imperialism that we're in. So if you're in the United States right now, if you're looking at Wall Street right now, the reason why the Wall Street firms behave in such a manner is because the great bulk of profits that are generated now inside the decaying imperial core come from speculation. They come from taking a gamble basically on what the next bubble is going to be, comes from insurance, comes from various different forms of financial services, comes from, of course, the export of capital and the repatriation of profits. All of which, of course, means that you need people, often on large amounts of white powder, I would imagine, on the trading floors, the digital trading floors these days, who are essentially inspired gamblers, people who can spot the next big thing that is coming along, the next bubble, get in on it at the right time, get out of it at the right time, and keep on betting correctly. And if you've got such people, you want to keep hold of them, and the way you keep hold of them is by stuffing their pockets full of dollars or perhaps bitcoins. Joke about the Bitcoin. So it's not as the Social Democrats complain about, that the bonuses created the wildly speculative, unstable system. Imperialism created that. Financialization is, of course, the inevitable byproduct of the imperialist system. Deindustrialization is an inevitable byproduct of capitalism developing to a certain stage where there is too much capital to invest profitably in the home country, and it has to go elsewhere to seek a return. And this creates greater and greater degrees of financialization, which is what created the current model that Wall Street and the City of London especially operate under. And so the system rewards wild speculation, it rewards risk taking, but that's not the reason why that happens. It happens because of the advanced stage of financialization that we're in. Now, going right back to the beginning and tying this together, if the AI bubble goes down, will it take the rest of the US economy with it? The answer is, of course, yes. Will that stop the speculators speculating? Will that stop the Wall Street casino? No, because they can't stop. If you try to bring the AI bubble into, shall we say, a more delicate landing, so it doesn't just burst, but perhaps deflate slowly, well, that wouldn't work, because as we covered on the last episode, or sorry, the 2 episodes previous, the all growth in the US economy for the previous period was based upon the growth of that bubble. So if you take that down, there is no growth in the United States. You might argue that most people don't see the benefits of growth anyway, but the whole system is rigged to just do this and do this and do this. Expand the bubble, expand it, expand it, expand it. And if the AI bubble goes down, which it will ultimately, then within a few years, barring that there isn't a sort of systemic collapse, then there'll be another bubble along which will do similar things, because that's just what the system is designed to do. And no politician, certainly not Donald Trump, certainly not Joe fucking Biden, has a single clue as to how to counteract that. Because to counteract that, you would need to essentially end the reign of the financiers, which of course no politician in the United States has the means or willingness to do, because it would mean essentially that you would be presiding over a collapse in the US system. Because if you tried to do that, the financiers would do vast capital flight, capital strike, drain investments, close down businesses, create an economic crisis and thus a political crisis inside the United States. And there's nobody in the US system who wants to tackle that. The Social Democrats will lie to you. The Social Democrats will tell you it's just a few evil bankers getting their bonuses. But the truth is much more terrifying, that it's this gigantic systemic issue of which the banker bonuses are just one visible manifestation of which encourages speculative behavior. But the truth is it's rooted in the system itself. You're trying to say that if you restricted banker bonuses, that you wouldn't see the unstable speculative behavior. It's like looking at somebody with a bullet wound to the head and giving them a paracetamol. Really might make you feel a little bit better, but in actual fact, the system itself is still very much zombified. So I will now pause just for a moment before moving to the discussion element of the program, the political discussion element of the program, and we're going to be talking in a few minutes just about the Kosygin reform of the 1960s, as it's 60 years since that took place. There is a very good report of a roundtable that was held on this by the KPI. So I would encourage everybody to read that, because it's a very detailed discussion informed by Communist Party veterans who were around at the time and historians. So what I'll do is I've just posted the link there. You probably won't be able to read that in the next 5 minutes, not unless you're very quick at reading. What I'll do is I'll just take a brief intermission, and then I will come back and we will discuss the Kosygin reform for a little while, and then get into some questions as well. So take a look at that, and I'll be back in just a few minutes. Welcome back, everybody. What we're going to do today is to go into a little bit of detail about the Kosygin reform. Now, this is something which is, again, very little known in the West and very, very poorly understood, if it is at all. And of course, it is much better known in Russia and the former Soviet Union. And recently, because it was 60 years since the Kosygin pushed forward what was referred to as the 8th five-year plan inside the USSR, that the KPRF held a roundtable about this and had a very extensive discussion, which I would encourage everybody who's interested in this to go and read that. It's very detailed and gives a lot of interesting analysis as to the nature of it. But here I want to outline some key themes, and perhaps we'll go into it in further detail in later episodes. For those of you who are unaware of Kosygin, Alexei Kosygin, he was a very important figure in both the Khrushchev and the Brezhnev periods in the Soviet Union. Was by all accounts, according to accounts from the KPRF, a hard-working and diligent man. I'm sure other opinions are available. Who put his name to a plan that was only partially his. It was based on ideas by an economist named Liebman, who it's argued by some, including the historian Evgeny Spitsin, that Liebman's ideas were promoted by key party bosses in order to facilitate further capitalist restoration. But the essence of let's call it the Kosygin-Liebman plan, the 8th five-year plan, was that the idea was that the USSR's growth rates had slowed down from their peak in the early to middle 1950s, and there needed to be another industrial advance. Now, if you go back into the details of this, you'll find that growth rates dipped after the death of Stalin and after the coming to power of Khrushchev and his clique, and the dismantling of the planned economy as it was run in the Stalin period. Again, there's various different reasons for this, but that we've gone into before. But by the middle 1960s, the slowing down in the rates of growth created part of the reason why why Khrushchev was removed. Though it's not the main reason, but there was a general agreement in the Soviet Party of the need for economic growth to be renewed. Although it must be said that the growth rates were still far above the growth rates in the West. So that I think that they'd gone down from the peak under the late Stalin period of around about 13% to growing by around about 7 to 8% in the middle 1960s. The Kosygin plan was supposed to revive Soviet economic growth to the point where it was reaching its prior high points. The idea was that they were going to cut down on centralized control, that they were going to cut down on the number of rationalize down the number of planning targets, increase the autonomy of various different Soviet enterprises, and of course secure industrial expansion. Now, in fact, I am tempted to do a more exhaustive look at this, but first of all, let's briefly talk about some successes. It's not fair to say that the Kosygin-Liebman plan was a complete failure, because there were certain successes within it. It's during the time that this was being enacted that the Soviet oil and gas industry leapt on, came on by leaps and bounds, overseen by Kosygin himself. So the pipelines in Far Eastern Russia and Siberia, for instance, were developed in this period. The further development of the oil and gas industries of the Central Asian republics all took place during this period. So there was some benefit in terms of building up the industrial base, mainly raw resource extraction, outside of European Russia and Ukraine. One of the criticisms that can legitimately be made of Soviet industrial expansion, certainly post Stalin and certainly under Khrushchev, was that far too much of it was based in like European Russia and Ukraine. Of course, Ukraine was a massive industrial center for the Soviet Union. But under the Kosygin plan, at least there was that push to expand certain industrial sectors in Lower Caucasus and Central Asian republics, mainly oil and gas. Now, it's also argued by some that this created part of the problem, which led ultimately to the Gorbachev-Yeltsin counter-revolution. But we'll come to that in just a moment. So the idea being that the autonomy of the different enterprises was going to be increased, that there would be increased mainly monetary rewards for meeting production targets, and that this was going to be part of a system that would push back into like greater economic growth. And so there was initially a boost in growth up to 8, nearly 9%, but it didn't last too long. It certainly wasn't as long lasting as the 5-year plans of the Stalin period. But there was a certain amount of industrial expansion. And so, again, not a total failure. But again, let's go back to analyzing things through the framework of dialectical materialism. It's never just enough to look at the growth rates. It's never just enough to look at the industrial expansion that did genuinely take place due to the Kosygin plan and its related plans that took place in the early 70s and the late 70s. The issue is, of course, not just whether the Kosygin plan promoted pro-capitalist norms of production and relations of production. The issue isn't just whether it encouraged the growth in towards the restoration of markets. You have to also consider this within the context of the greater problems facing the Soviet system that had occurred since the Khrushchev period. Though many of them were there during the later Stalin period, but they were at least under control. The Khrushchev period essentially sets up the reasons why the Kosygin reform does lead to ultimately or contribute to the counter-revolution. Because Khrushchev, in his sort of wildly swinging backwards and forwards of policies, one of the consistent themes was, though, that the power of the enterprise managers in the Soviet Union was increased under Khrushchev. Now, he zigzagged back on this constantly, seemingly depending upon what mood he was in. Sometimes he favored the bureaucrats. Sometimes he led campaigns against them. Sometimes he was in favor of bureaucratic stability. Sometimes Khrushchev, that is, oversaw an attempt to stop institutionalization or sort of solidification of bureaucratic power by moving officials around between different jobs to stop them growing a power base. All of this again, this was part of the picture as to why Khrushchev was ultimately removed by the very apparatus he'd previously been allied with. Point being that it is absolutely correct to say that under Khrushchev, the power of the managers of various different enterprises vastly increased. And also, due to the fact that the dictatorship of the proletariat was removed and the necessity of class struggle under a workers' state was denied by the Khrushchev's waffling bullshit about a state of the whole people, which is key reason or key part of the dispute between them and the Communist Party of China at the time. This led to a situation where there was more and more of a case of the enterprise managers not only having more power, but also using that power in corrupt ways, because there was less scrutiny upon them than had been in the previous Stalin era. And so you got things like the shadow economy emerging, which some argue had always been there, and there was always going to be a certain amount of corruption, a certain amount of treachery. But under Khrushchev and certainly under Brezhnev, this took off. So where you've got a reform like the Kosygin-Liebman reforms, which further pushed, to a degree anyway, the idea of autonomy of the enterprises and further pushed the idea of financial rewards for superior performance in production. What it did was it fed all of the worst tendencies that had been there in the Khrushchev period. It fed the willingness, it fueled the willingness of the enterprise managers to lie about their production figures. It fueled corruption, because suddenly if you were able to present impressive production figures, then you got more money. And if you got more money, well, then not only was that good for you, but it might mean you could also go into business for yourself on the side in the shadow economy, which grew exponentially in the Brezhnev period. Now, it must also be said that the Kosygin-Liebman reforms were also truncated due to disputes within the CPC and the state structure. The idea that one of the ideas of the Kosygin reforms was ultimately that they were going to try and slim down the bureaucracy, and the bureaucracy certainly didn't want that. So you ended up with it being only implemented in a truncated manner, but the elements that were implemented were done so in such a way as to fuel the basis for the Gorbachev counter-revolution, which came from ultimately the pro-capitalist elements who formed the basis of the later oligarchy. And it also, according to some analysts in the KPRF discussion, which again I would encourage you all to read, it also fueled the development of clans within the Soviet system. So clans based around certain industries. So if you look at again, like people like that revolting bastard Leonid Kuchma in Ukraine. He was a senior industrial manager in the Soviet period, as was, although of a slightly more junior rank, Yanukovych, also Ukrainian president. And both in Russia and in Ukraine, certainly both of these countries, and in the Central Asian republics, these clans based around industry or political connections formed the basis of the counter-revolutionary tendencies. So it was the senior officialdom in industry who either went on to dominate politics or industry, or in the case of Ukraine, both, and who treated all of the state property, even prior to Gorbachev's infamous privatizations, or the beginning of the privatizations. They already treated it as if it was their own property to dispose of. They just wanted to Gorbachev and then Yeltsin to make all that legal. So by giving the industrial managers more and more autonomy in the Kosygin reform and in the Brezhnev period to a degree, you got essentially the emergence of a system whereby you had, if you were an industrial manager in the Soviet Union at that time, you essentially ran an enterprise that was almost a private empire. Yes, you could be removed. Yes, if you fucked up too much, you could be arrested. But if you made sure that you were careful about things and you made sure that you paid homage to the right people, said all the right things, sung the songs at the May Day parades at the right degree of gusto, you could get away with an awful lot. Now, I must qualify this further by saying that even that period, even the Brezhnev and Andropov and Chernenko periods, when the industrial clan system was emerging, was still more beneficial to the Soviet working class than anything that followed it. But because it was still hard for them to just do away with the state property and openly grab it, that's why they chose Gorbachev to push that through. And it's why ultimately they abandoned Gorbachev for Yeltsin, who would push it through with more ruthlessness and with a greater degree of savagery in terms of waging a class war upon the Soviet working class. But the Kosygin reform, crucial to understanding this, because this is where the clan system gets boosted dramatically. It's why so much power ends up in the hands of people like Leonid Kuchma or Yanukovych or many of the other oligarchs who all emerge as good CPSU members, of course, or members of the Komsomol, or both. And it's why you end up with such a strange system emerging in post-Soviet Russia, Ukraine, etc. In Ukraine's case, ultimately, fatally. The Kosygin reform, whilst it had some successes, and needn't necessarily have led to full capitalist restoration, because it was brought in at a time when you had already had a degree of restoration of bourgeois norms in production, the demolition of the dictatorship of the proletariat, the fraudulent state of the whole people brought in by Khrushchev, the specific denial of class struggle, and the decay of the party as a result. You throw all that into the mix, along with the contagion that came from Soviet integration into the global oil and gas markets, which again created a layer of people in the Soviet system whose incomes and whose future profits were dependent upon continued good relations with the capitalist countries, especially with the imperialist countries. And you had a solid layer emerging by the early 1980s who backed Gorbachev, who were in favor of full capitalist restoration, because whilst they had a great degree of control and were able to reap a great degree of personal benefit from their position in the Soviet system via corruption, via running private empires, via associations with organized crime, they wanted to convert that into full-blown property ownership, and Gorbachev was their chosen man. So the Kosygin reform, whilst it had its industrial achievements, whilst it need not necessarily have led to full-blown capitalist restoration, ended up pushing open the door towards capitalist restoration even further. And that's essentially how it must be remembered. There are those, even in the KPRF, it seems, who defend the Kosygin reform to this day and say it need not necessarily go the way that it did. But in the context that it was introduced, where you had an already weakened a working class that had already been politically weakened, ideologically disempowered, then and a system where the management systems, managers of industry and the senior party officials were already building private empires themselves, the Kosygin reform made all of that considerably worse. So I'd encourage you to read the full report from the KPRF. Very interesting roundtable discussion that they had on that. So everybody should pay attention to that. Right. Going to take a couple of questions before we close out today at 2:30 Perfidious Albion time. So be sure to like and share the stream if you have not done so already, and we will get into a couple of questions. Down with Zionist says, many claim that the USSR was state capitalist and essentially a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie during its revisionist period. How accurate is that? It's not accurate at all. If it was that, then the Gorbachev and Yeltsin periods would not have been necessary. So if you had if it was a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, if there was like a full-blown capitalist class in the Soviet Union that controlled the means of production fully, then and was able to extract profits from them, the destruction of the CPSU and the destruction of the Soviet state would not have been necessary. See, if they'd got what they wanted via the Soviet party and state, then they wouldn't have needed to do the counter-revolution. The counter-revolution was necessitated because whilst the pro-bourgeois elements within the Soviet party were able to gain a lot from corrupt practices, dishonest practices, criminal practices, and build little empires for themselves and position themselves as a capitalist class in waiting, they were still, in the end, just officials. Yes, officials who had a private empire. Yes, officials who could wield a great deal of power. But in the end, like prior to Gorbachev anyway, it was still the case that if they got exposed, if they fucked up too much, that they could be arrested and they could lose everything theoretically. And they didn't want to take that risk. They needed to convert the informal control and corrupt networks that they had into real capitalist power. And how do you do that? You do that by, in the end, you have to destroy the Soviet Party, the CPSU, and you had to destroy the Soviet state. And because that would enable you then to convert your informal status as like a sort of chieftain in a particular area of industry or a particular area, geographical area. You would then be able to convert that into a sort of full-blown capitalist power, which is what they wanted. And so hence the privatization drive, and hence also the destruction of the party. Because even though the party had become less proletarian, dominated by pseudo-intellectual wankers and various different senior managers, there was still a good, my estimate would be, third of it was solidly proletarian. And even some of the intellectuals were of a more proletarian bent. They were those who were more in line with the proletarian ideology. And so the attempt by Gorbachev to completely dismantle the system via the party didn't work. So there was too much opposition within the Soviet party, which is why he pushes the so-called democratization. He has to push that because he has to bring in openly pro-capitalist parties who can advance the cause of the destruction of socialism without opposition, and he does it in the name of democratization. That's why you get the Congress of People's Deputies. That's why you get the so-called free elections. It is because Gorbachev and Yakovlev and the others can't get their way completely the way they want it within the party structures. They need to dilute the power of the party. They need to destroy the power of the party, ultimately, even though, of course, it is the party that gave them everything. But, who says that revisionists are ever bound by ties of gratitude and loyalty? And that's why, ultimately, you get people like Anatoly Sobchak, the Putin's political mentor, walks out along with Yeltsin of the CPSU when Gorbachev does away with the CPSU's monopoly on power, because suddenly they don't have to be part of the CPSU anymore in order to advance their agenda. In order to advance their agenda, it is better to be outside of it and be able to wage war constantly on it. So what you see in that Gorbachev period is that Gorbachev himself, Yakovlev, Yeltsin, Sobchak, and the other so-called Democrats, all waging war upon the CPSU. And that tells you that, again, for all of the rot, for all of the corruption, for all the degeneration overseen by Khrushchev in the revisionist period and the Brezhnev period, in the Khrushchev and Brezhnev periods, all of that decay still left a solid core of Soviet workers across the USSR, maybe excluding the Baltic states, though there was certain things in the Baltic states I think need to be analyzed in maybe a different way, but like certainly in Belarus, Ukraine, Russia, the Central Asian republics. Again, Armenia is a bit of a funny one, declared independence fairly early. But for the great bulk of the Soviet Union, for the great bulk of the Soviet Union, the most organized elements of the working class were, until fairly late on, still loyal to the idea of the Soviet Union, and were still fundamentally loyal to the Soviet Party, even when you got like industrial disputes, even though you got a lot of chaos towards the end, and again deliberately engineered by Gorbachev and exploited by Yeltsin. So the fact is that even after all the decay, the party was still the biggest organized potential fighting force of the Soviet working class. It lacked leaders. Its ideology had been diluted to the point of almost non-existence. But because it represented this great bulk of Soviet workers who were willing to organize and fight to preserve the Soviet Union, and who were going to get in the way of the kind of capitalist restoration that rats like Sobchak and Yeltsin wanted, that's why the party had to be destroyed. And that tells us that, for all that I have a certain admiration for people like Enver Hoxha, and for certain things that were done in the Chinese Cultural Revolution, their analysis of the Soviet Union was fundamentally wrong. Because if they were right, then all of the stuff that happened under Gorbachev would not have been necessary. If there was already a dictatorship, a full-blown dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, disguised by the party, then again, like, it wouldn't have been necessary to do what was done. And what was done was a quite deliberate and well worked out plan that required the destruction of the Soviet party. And that is ultimately what was done. Right. Okay. So Ben in Hungary says, and Putin still idolizes Sobchak, and sadly the collaborator Ivan Ilyin makes me want to puke every time he quotes that. Maggots. Yes. I mean, this is the contradictions that face the Russian system. On the one hand, they have been drawn into a fundamental conflict with US imperialism that now has to be fought to a finish. And on the other hand, it is being fought by various different by a bourgeois system overseen by a Bonapartist group headed by Putin, but by no means just ruled by him. And it is a system which has been desperately trying to to balance between the different elements within it, including those who want desperately to see a full restoration of relations with the United States. Only problem for people like Kirill Dmitriev is that the United States doesn't want good relations with Russia. They want Russia to be destroyed or subjugated. Maybe they'll take some time out to go and try and subjugate China. Probably won't work, but the fact is there's no negotiation to be had, and even Putin must know that by this stage. That's why, by the way, that's why Medvedev makes the statements that he does. There's a lot of speculation as to what role Medvedev plays, but every statement that he makes is it is informed by, and I would say approved by, the highest levels of the Kremlin. There's no way that a senior Russian minister goes, if you'll pardon the term, off the reservation as much as Medvedev do. He's not going off the reservation at all. What he's doing is he's expressing in more forceful language what is the developing point of view within the Russian system. Now, he's doing that also, of course, as a place the gallery, gather a personal following for himself. Maybe he thinks he can take another tilt at the presidency in a few years' time, perhaps. But all of the things that he posts are just more melodramatically worded versions of what the Russian government's already come to a conclusion about. If he says something, it's just a more melodramatic version of a discussion that's already been had. Now, when Medvedev says his latest thing about Trump and the summit being cancelled, it's because the discussion within the Russian government has already reached the point where they've finally, those who are putting forward the point of view that you can't negotiate with the US imperialists, have had their point proven for them by the US imperialists themselves. Now, to go back to Ben's point, the Russian system is a very strange hybrid, given that it is the Putin system is based on constantly trying to reconcile irreconcilable forces, trying to reconcile a necessary defense of the Stalin period with the thoughts of Ivan Ilyin, who was a pro-fascist thinker who was living in exile in Germany, to reconcile that takes enormous mental contortions, which again, because the Putin system seeks to represent all these different elements in Russian history as representing some sort of uninterrupted story of which Putin and United Russia are sort of a logical outgrowth of that process, and trying to deny, of course, deny class struggle. These are all, of course, Brezhnevite cadres, so of course they deny class struggle. But it leads to them making bizarre bizarre statements like the ones that Putin makes about like how Lenin was an evil traitor, but the Stalin period is one that we claim ownership of. Of course, as Stalin would correctly say, there is no Stalin without Lenin. There are no achievements in the 5-year plans. There is no successful defense of the nation and defeat of Nazism without the October Revolution, without the comprehensive destruction of Tsardom, the remains of feudalism, and the rottenness of the Russian bourgeoisie. The Putin system is an incredibly contradictory beast. I mean, you're watching a bunch of guys be drawn into a fight with Western imperialism that none of them would have chosen to do, but they've had to engage in it because it's that or get destroyed. And thankfully, the balance of forces inside Russia has reached the point where the leadership has to actually keep the fight up, because if they don't, then they'll be destroyed, themselves be destroyed. Right. Svetlana, hello to you, says Medvedev's job is to play clown jester. He may play well with some in the West, but here in Russia, he's basically seen as a clown. Well, he seems to have taken over from Vladimir Zhirinovsky, Fran Save PR says, can you do a video on the Irish politics? Today's a presidential election. Left candidate is poised to win. I will make a note of that then. I'll cover it in the next episode of this program. The book by Anthony Sutton is pure ahistorical nonsense, says Matewan Massacre. I think that's Sid. He masks the usual anti-Semitic narrative in hyperbole about Wall Street and the Bolsheviks. Yeah. I mean, this is like absolute garbage from people like Sutton. It used to be that the fascists were a bit more honest when they said that, the Bolshevik Revolution was a Jewish banker conspiracy. Now it's a Wall Street conspiracy. Quite why Wall Street would want to back the Russian Revolution and then send an armed force in to crush it a few years later. This is a mystery. But then again, the fascist narrative isn't supposed to make any sense. It's just meant to play on the emotions, which is what fascism is all about. It's all about prioritizing the emotive and the emotional. That is what is why fascists have the success that they do. The fascist must never think about or examine anything too much, because if you did, then you wouldn't be a fascist anymore. Just float along on a cloud of emotions and be directed where the great Führer tells you to. Right. Okay. So announcements for the future. So coming up over the course of the weekend, there will be a next episode, or I should say a renewal of the series that I'm going to be doing on Antonio Gramsci. That's going to be a live stream on Patreon. So look out for that on Sunday of this week. We have an episode of Decline and Fall for you coming out tomorrow for the weekend. So keep an eye out for that. We also have upcoming film reviews on Patreon, and the new schedule of shows on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday will continue. I'm aware there's a couple of things I couldn't get to today, including the saber rattling or the flaccid saber rattling of Donald Trump against Venezuela. We'll get to that in a future show. I'd also say that we've got there'll be a Q&A coming up very soon. I just need to schedule that in, so keep an eye out for that one. But until tomorrow, when I'll be back to you in one form or another, I thank everybody for tuning in. Thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon, Substack, and Buy Me a Coffee. Thanks to everybody who's tuned in today. And I'll now throw you back over to the always very impressive intro and outro video. Full credit to this work, of course, goes to the gentleman who by the name of Red Chilean on Twitter. So thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you again soon.
Утреннего стяг в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, реют над страною ветры яростных атак, и вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы, будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы.
Продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди.
С неба милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути.
И вновь